Please, once again, give a warm welcome to Kelly Beaver.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So I'm not going to be the first person today to talk about electoral, but I am actually a political pollster, and therefore hopefully what I have to say will interest you somewhat. In talking a little bit about the trends that are ahead of us in 2024, I would be completely remiss to not talk about what is going to be a bumper year for democracy. All of the major democracies of the world, the US, India, Indonesia, will take to the polls this year. 4.5 billion people in total across the world. And of course, a number of other geopolitically tense parts of this world will also go to the polls. Ukraine and Russia, non-events perhaps, but for very different reasons. And I know Ian earlier may have touched a little bit on Taiwan. But when you could be talking about a celebration of significant democratic movements, what we might be talking about throughout 2024 is that the roll of every single dice could end up on the difference between democracy and autocracy, chaos and order. But what it also means, a lot of voters, a lot of voting equals a lot of political advertising. And in the UK, we have seen a rise in the spending caps for political parties to the tune of 80% between 2019 and indeed what will take place, if you believe the politicians, which the majority of the general public do not, at some point towards the back end of this year, October, November, most likely, if you watch the pundits. But with that 80%, yes, that's a sizable uplift from around 19 million to 35 million, but it's actually more just really in line with the inflationary movement that we have seen over that time period. There are other major events next year, sporting events, that will also see an increase in advertising revenues. But of most significant impact, of course, is that US election, where they're going to spend over 10 billion in political advertising. That is the key event in town. Now, with key events such as that, we also see a real opportunity for a continued testbed of disinformation, and the panel just spoke a little bit about misinformation and that being on the rise. And of course, you may have already seen these absolutely grotesque pictures that I'm showing you now, and please avert your eyes if you do want to get some sleep tonight. But these pictures are just the knife edge of what actually is feasible today. We've already seen proliferation of voice recordings, which sound incredibly like the politicians. And what we are likely to see throughout the course of 2024 is a real difficulty in distinguishing for the British public between what is real and what is not real, and closer to the bone, things that really could be the politician rather than snapshots of them cheating on their spouses, things that really matter in political debates. So I'm going to wipe that from your memory, so take that out, and let me instead tell you about my reflections. Ipsos has been collating data here and interpreting it in the UK for over 50 years. And when I look back across the trends of data that we hold on social and political and economic perceptions amongst the British public, I can see 5 key things this year that you should be thinking about, and also hopefully give you a few hints on how to interpret the information that is going to be arising in front of you. So the first of those. So we are, as I say, very likely to have an election during the second half of this year. And when you look at the voting intention polling that we and others conduct, you can see that Labour have a sizable vote share comparatively to the Conservative Party. Now that vote share, it does matter, but if you work in political polling, you don't watch the share, you watch the lead. So look at the lead. 25 points at that moment of that brief Liz Truss interlude that you might all remember. It was very limited, but around September 2022, we saw that vote share for Labour really take off. But look at it today. That vote share, yes, still sitting high, but the lead has reduced. And if we go back through the Maury archives, so Ipsos Maury, the Maury archives, back to 1964, and we have a look at what has happened in every single electoral event where there was a double-digit lead for the opposition party in the run-in to an election. It closes, The lead closes, it narrows, it halves. Even for Tony Blair, who was incredibly popular, Keir Starmer is not, it halved, but he still had enough to maintain a majority. If Keir Starmer's lead was to halve in the run-up to the general election, he would not have a commanding majority. So we would end up with a much more fragmented government, perhaps, instead of what looks, if you focus on the share, like it would be a clean Labour take. So there's a lot happening beneath the surface. The Conservative Party, they are polling below 30%. Now that is unheard of for the main two political parties, and they have been doing so for some time. There's definitely no love for the Conservatives, but actually it's a very soft Labour lead. When you push people, you ask them the extent to which they've really truly decided their vote, over half have not. So there's still a lot to play for. And what you will see in the run-up to that election is a lot of very tactical segmentation, audience analysis, considering really carefully how each of those parties targets each of the segments with very different messages through different modes, because the public is not all online. Second key thing, which I think Ian will have touched on, is a sense of how the British people are starting to feel about the economy. Now, you might not know this about British people, but they're genuinely net pessimistic about most things, but in particular about the economy. And when we ask, we expect a net negative optimism rating, but it did reach a low point over the course of 22 and 23. And what we've started to see is that has softened, and we are seeing what I would call the green shoots of economic optimism or less economic pessimism come into the British psyche. Now that isn't for everyone, and that's not everywhere. And I think beneath the surface of this headline, you will see some real differentials start to take shape over the course of 2024, as those in the higher income categories with more disposable income start to feel the pressure a bit less, which means, of course, that they themselves, again, would need to be targeted in quite a different way. One of our recent outputs, the Signs of Success, which looks at what British people believe it means to be successful in Britain today, and what are the signs that you're successful and that you look for with others. Only 10% would say that flashy and ostentatious things is now a sign of success. Go back a couple of decades ago, and actually what you own and how you portray what you own was more of a sign of success. So thinking about that as we go into 2024. So 2024 is actually the Chinese year of the dragon. And if you are following the Chinese calendar, and in many countries they do, you will perhaps see spikes in the birth rate in those countries during the years of dragons, because they're perceived to be years of luck, and those individuals themselves are garnering luck as a result of the year in which they are born. Now, in Britain, when we look at our data, we're a bit more dragon than we were in 2023. In 2023, I think universally people would say it was a bad year for the country. It was a bad year, and when you look comparatively across 31 countries, which we did, Britain is up there in the top 4 countries saying that it was a bad year for their country, and the others are countries like Turkey experiencing really high inflation, or other countries where they were having really big issues with crime. So not a great year for our country, and we were agreed. This year, a bit more dragon. We are actually nearly 2/3 say that 2024 is going to be better than 2023. And we're much more at the average level of optimism when we look across those 31 countries. Now, what do we know from our affluent surveys? We know that when there is optimism, there is consumption. And those two things tie together quite nicely. So that is a positive sign as we go into the year ahead. Now, you've spoken about this at length. I heard your panel earlier touch on it, and I know many of your speakers will have. At Ipsos, we're talking about the wonder, but also the worry of generative AI. And I want to take a bit of a show of hands in this room about the extent to which each of you have played about with generative AI. Would you raise your hand if you've had a go, if you've been on, if you've had a look? That's a very high proportion. I am not a pollster. Oh wait, no, it's a very high proportion. I would say somewhere between 80 and 90% if I was at a push. You fit very neatly in with the results from our global business influencers study, where 8 in 10 of business leaders are telling us that they've tried out generative AI at least once. Well, sure, everybody's using it then? No, they're not. So our UCOM endorsed Iris platform, which helps us to understand what people are doing online, the truth of what's happening in a digital environment, we can see that it's only 7% across the UK population who are accessing and playing with AI, which makes us reflect a little bit on the environments in which we are collating our information, and I mean that as business professionals, versus what's truly happening amongst the British public. Now, we're not on our own, and I talk about the wonder, and I also talk about the worry. The reason the population is not using it isn't because they're not interested in it, but there is a significant degree of concern and anxiety. This, again, a study across multiple countries. You can see where Britain is placed when we ask about whether people feel excited or whether AI makes them feel nervous. So we have a range of European nations where they're still, they're nervous, but they're also excited. Look at who's most nervous. It's those Anglosphere countries, including the UK. Now, granted, AI and generative AI is stronger currently in the English language. Perhaps that is why we're seeing this rise in concern. But it fits with other data that we hold, which tells us that the UK, which 10 years ago I would have described us as a tech optimist nation, we're now much more tech skeptic than we were. We've seen a 20-point rise in the proportion of people who tell us that AI is destroying our lives between 2013 and 2023. If you want to go to a tech optimist place, head over to Asia and LATAM, because in that part of the world, they are still tech optimists. But for those of us who operate in a business environment, who consume and also produce information, evidence, being aware of how the public perceive and some of their concerns around AI will help us to shape how we communicate and how we bring them along the journey, because it is, in 2024, going to be a bigger part of our journey. Now, I wanted to end with some notes of positivity in our data, and back to the Signs of Success report, which we published just at the back end of last year. So yes, the public are worried, they're anxious, they think the country's largely going in the wrong direction, and you see they're worried about AI, they're worried about government, they're worried about politics, they're worried about the economy. But when you ask them about themselves, the majority will tell you that they believe they've been either very successful or successful in their own lives. So our reflections on ourselves and our levels of success in this country are actually relatively high, which is a positive and optimistic message for advertisers to understand. Another key message, you talked a lot about trust today. I have the Ipsos Veracity Index here, and I have some good news for you. Some really good news. Look, it's on the move in the right direction. This is actually one of the highest scores that we've recorded for advertising executives over the 20 years that we've been doing this. 16%, which is impressive, ahead of government ministers and politicians generally. But of course, we cannot get too excited, because this is it in context. And now, you cannot expect, if you understand what builds people's perceptions of trustworthiness, you would never expect advertising executives to be at the top end of the Veracity Index. You're not going to be able to compete with a doctor or a nurse. But surely you can compete with the pollsters who are in the middle. So I would say in 2024, you've got generative AI to grapple with, to compete with, and to ensure that your communication is trusted. But ultimately, you've room for improvement on the Veracity Index too. So in conclusion, 2023, yes, it was a pretty crappy year, but comparatively to 2022, it was less disruption in certain parts of our lives. 2024, the public do believe and have a sense of optimism, and they are expecting a degree of change. And we know there will be some change, whether that is in the economy, politically, but their expectation is definitely higher. There are a lot of queries about what will happen with our economy this year, and Ian will have covered this much better than I would. But what we can talk about is people's sentiment and how they're feeling, and how we are likely to see in 2024 more segmentation in the experiences that individuals in Britain are having, and the haves, the have-nots, and what that means for how you segment your consumer base, how you understand your audiences, because in different parts of this country and in different income segments, their experience of life and what appeals to them will be very different, and the political parties will really want to understand that too. Have a look at signs of success. And then lastly, don't forget to get out of your own echo chamber. There's quite a big gap between what happens and what is perceived from execs in places like this room and what the public think on AI, on climate. They're very split at the minute, given other pressures, even on diversity and on woke issues. So please do get out of your echo chamber. This work with ThinkBox that we did at the back end of 2022 just shows you media professionals are twice as likely to use Instagram, twice as likely to use Twitter than the general public, and more so with TikTok. The general public, they love news at 10, they're on Facebook. So please recognize the importance of understanding the public. They are a key asset and also a key commercial opportunity. Thank you very much.